In 1917, the Russian Revolution began, with political unrest throughout the country. Due to economic hardship, food shortages, and government corruption, groups of rebels formed, named Bolsheviks, eventually taking control of the government. During this time, rebel forces fought across the country. As the country was in turmoil, these rebel groups often traversed dangerous, freezing cold temperatures in order to avoid confronting the enemy head-on. In the winter of 1925, one group of rebels was traveling through the snowy Pamir Mountains in Central Asia. The group was led by a general named Topilsky. One morning, the group would find strange footprints nearby the mouth of a cave. What they found next would puzzle Russian scientists to this day. In today's episode, we will explore this strange story, as well as one mad scientist from Russia who attempted to create a human-ape hybrid in the early 20th century. In 1925, in the freezing cold in modern-day Tajikistan, General Topilsky and his men were traversing the Pamir Mountains and were on the lookout for the enemy. Soon the men heard noises from a nearby cave, and believing it was the enemy, the men surrounded it. Then they heard a noise that didn't sound like any animal that resided in the mountain range. The men fired in the cave, and when the smoke cleared, what they saw next would truly shock them. As the men walked up to the cave, they would be stunned to see a naked, hairy humanoid dead in the snow. The rebels and Topilsky were absolutely puzzled at what they had just killed. Initially, they thought it was an ape, but as they looked closer, they could see that this was no ape. Brown bears live in the area, but this was definitely no brown bear. Even more so, the men all knew that no apes lived in this section of the mountains. The beast had many traits of being a normal human, but didn't look like a normal human. As they further examined the body, the hands and feet were wider than average. However, the legs and arms looked normal and seemed to be a normal length. The beast had wide bones, and it looked slightly Mongolian. Still, the creature had a heavy brow and a sloping forehead, which are not traits of Homo sapiens. As the men continued examining the body, some believed it was human, while others thought it was some sort of ape. After some time, the men decided to bury the beast under some rocks. In time, scholars in Russia would study this event and believe that Topilsky and his men had killed a Neanderthal. Neanderthals had successfully lived throughout Europe and much of Western Asia. They lived by hunting and fishing and lived in small communities. However, it's always been a mystery how they suddenly vanished in a few thousand years. It is believed by some that some Neanderthals did survive in tiny populations around the world in remote areas. Still, there's no hard evidence for this, and most tales of encounters with Neanderthal-looking beings or wild men have no physical evidence like photos or videos. Today, it's universally believed that the Neanderthal man vanished between 30,000 and 40,000 years ago when they were wiped out by Cro-Magnon invaders. The Cro-Magnon is modern-day humans' direct ancestor. They resemble us in every physical way. It is interesting that the Cro-Magnons suddenly came on the scene in Europe, although their exact origins still remain a mystery. A Russian scholar named Professor Porshnov of Moscow believed that the wild man seen in the woods of Russia were actually Neanderthals. The professor argued that many of the sightings of primitive wild men have many characteristics of the historic Neanderthal. He also went on to say it appears these wild men had lost all their tool-making and hunting skills and fallen back into a way of life more primitive than they had compared to their ancestors 40,000 years ago. In Mongolia and parts of Russia, These wild men have long been called by locals as Almas. It's important to note, too, that there appears to be a thin line between the wild men and more ape-like creatures like Sasquatch. Some believe that these wild men are actually a descendant of apes. Russia, though, has a long history with people having encounters with wild men or Almas. One of the most well-known stories concerning a Russian trying to breed a wild man or Alma concerns a Russian scientist named Ilya Ivanov. Ivanov was a Russian biologist who specialized in artificial insemination. Nicknamed the Red Frankenstein, Ivanov traveled to Guinea in February 1926 with the goal of creating a hybrid, half-man, half-ape. It's important to point out during this time the Bolsheviks were very strict and almost let no one leave the country. Despite this, the Soviet Union was very interested in what Ivanov could do. This was most likely due to the fact that if he was successful, that it would prove Darwin right and that Homo sapiens did in fact evolve from apes. Since the Bolsheviks were trying to get rid of a religion, more evidence supporting Darwin's theory could help their cause. Ivanov would travel around and get several chimps and try to cross humans and apes several ways. First, he tried to implant a woman's uterus just into an ape and inseminate the ape with human sperm. Next, he tried to inseminate women with chimp sperm. At first, he couldn't find any volunteers in Guinea, as the area under French rule wouldn't allow it. So he decided to go to the subtropical Soviet Republic of Abkhazia. There, he would travel along with around 4 chimps and would find 5 volunteers willing to be inseminated. Reports say the women volunteered for the experiment, but more than likely they were forced to. Many have questioned why the Soviet government and Ivanov himself would want to do these experiments. Some think the Soviets were trying to create some type of super soldier for their army by combining a human's intelligence with an ape's strength. Over the years, there's been numerous reports of wild men and even wild women like Zana of Abkhazia, which we covered in a prior episode. Still, to date, we are no closer to discovering whether these beasts are human, ape, or something new altogether.